Today, I will walk you through the process of creating a LARP-safe arrow mold. For a walkthrough on how to cast professional-style LARP arrows, see my other video. First, a master positive arrow must be created. I did this from wood pieces available from an online hobby store. This particular positive was made from a 2-inch dowel rod that is trimmed to 3 inches long, attached to a 2-inch round cone that is also 3 inches long. I also have a positive that is a bit smaller and has a rounded top as opposed to flat. After gluing the main body of your positive, a shaft also needs to be added. I used a 3/8 inch dowel rod. I trimmed about a 1/2 inch off the cone portion of my master, then drilled a hole to glue in my shaft. Try to keep this as centered as possible, but being a little off will not ruin your positive. With the positive finished, now a sort of cradle needs to be built. Take a printout of your positive that matches its dimensions as a guide. Lightly glue it to a board that is precisely half the height of your master when laid on its side. Since this is a 2-inch arrow, it must be 1 inch. If you do not have a board of that height, you can attach parts of a hobby board together to correct it. I used a 3/4 inch board with 1/4 inch pieces glued to the bottom to reach the required height. The cradle must be at least 1 inch wider than the master, and should extend the same distance from the front. I have mine at about 1 3/4 inch. Now cut out the shape you have attached to your cradle using a jigsaw. You want to be as close to the size as your master as possible, but it should be large enough that the master can rest inside the hole loosely. To ensure the shaft is laying properly, build up a small riser that allows precisely half the shaft to sit above the cradle. Now trim off any excess shaft so it's flush with the back wall of the cradle. You are now ready to cast your positive. But first, we need to build the box the mold will be cast in. Using 4 flat boards that are at least the height of the desired size of your mold, attach small blocks that are large enough to be gripped by clamps. You can wood glue these, as done here, or screw them together. Be sure the screw is set on the outside wall of each board, not the inside. You also need to grease up your mold positive and the cradle it sits in. Using petroleum jelly, cover every part of the master and cradle that will touch the plaster. Fill every gap between the cradle and the master. No gap should be missed. There needs to be enough petroleum jelly to block any gap in the mold, but not so much as to lose detail on the edges. Gaps will allow plaster to seep in and ruin your mold. Once the boards are ready and the master and the cradle are greased, arrange the boards around the cradle as demonstrated, using 4 clamps to tightly lock the cradle inside. Now smear petroleum jelly around the inside walls of the boards. As with the cradle, be sure all gaps are covered in petroleum jelly, or the plaster will seep through. Pay close attention to the corners and where the boards touch the cradle. Using a large bucket, add UltraCal 30. Be sure to note the weight of the dry plaster, as you will need that information to calculate the water needed to be added. For this particular mold, I used 1,650 grams of plaster, just a little over 3.5 pounds. Taking note of how much plaster I've used, I now need 38% of that weight in water. UltraCal 30 mixes at a 38 to 100 ratio by weight. After calculating the water weight needed, add that to the plaster powder. Mix thoroughly. Try to eliminate any plaster clumps possible. Once properly mixed, pour the plaster into the mold. You don't necessarily need to fill the mold, it just needs to be filled enough to be at least a 1/2 inch thicker than your positive, though 3/4 inch or more is ideal. Using a hammer or mallet, tap all sides of the mold box for a few minutes to eliminate air bubbles that may be trapped in the liquid. Allow the plaster to cure for 45 minutes to an hour. While curing, the plaster gets very hot. Do not expose curing plaster to skin. Once hardened, remove the clamps and walls from the mold. The plaster may feel sweaty and leave condensation. This is normal. It will eventually be bone dry. Now pull your cradle apart from the plaster. Congratulations, you have half of your mold. If your positive is stuck in your mold, use a very thin flathead screwdriver to pry the positive out. Be careful not to damage the mold or your positive, although a small amount of damage won't ruin it. After you are able to remove your positive, you will place it back into the half of the mold you just created. This half is now your cradle. Using a very large drill bit, drill 4 shallow impressions near each corner of your mold. These will be your mold keys to ensure both halves of the mold line up correctly. Now, smear petroleum jelly over the mold and the positive the same way as was done with the cradle, once again covering any gaps. Add the walls again and clamp as before. Smear petroleum jelly on the inside walls again, covering all gaps. Mix about the same amount of Ultracal 30 with water and fill the mold box. Allow to cure another 45 to 60 minutes. Remove the walls and clamps as before and carefully pry apart your mold halves. Then remove your positive. Congratulations! You have made your mold. If you'd like to see how to cast your own arrows using your newly created mold, click here. If you'd like to go straight to casting without creating your own mold, click the link in the description to buy a made-to-order mold from me. Any questions? Is something not working right? Leave a comment. Thanks for watching.